The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the House Judiciary Committee chamber, casting long shadows across the mahogany tables where America's political elite gathered for what promised to be another routine hearing on healthcare reform. The C-SPAN cameras hummed quietly, their red recording lights blinking like the eyes of watchful predators. In the gallery, journalists clutched their notebooks and smartphones, while congressional staffers whispered among themselves, sensing the electric tension that always preceded a storm. Congressman Jim Jordan sat at the dais, his muscular frame coiled like a spring ready to unleash. At 61, the Ohio Republican had built his reputation on aggressive questioning and theatrical displays that turned dry policy discussions into must-watch television. His tie was loosened just enough to suggest a man ready for battle, and his sleeves were rolled up, a deliberate signal that he meant business. The committee room had seen Jordan in action before, but today felt different. Today, he seemed particularly eager to draw blood. Across the room, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez adjusted the microphone at the witness table with the practiced ease of someone who had weathered countless political storms. The 35-year-old congresswoman from New York carried herself with a quiet confidence that belied her relatively brief time in Washington. Her dark blazer was impeccably tailored, professional yet accessible, the uniform of someone who understood that every appearance was a performance. In front of her lay a simple manila folder, unremarkable except for the way her fingers occasionally brushed its edge, as if checking that something precious remained safely inside. The chamber gradually filled as members filed in, their conversations dying to respectful murmurs as Chairman Jordan called the session to order. The gavel's sharp crack echoed through the room like a starting pistol, and every eye turned toward the Republican from Ohio. "The committee will come to order," Jordan announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "Today we examine the so-called Medicare for All proposal and its devastating impact on American healthcare." He paused, letting the word devastating hang in the air like a blade poised to strike. "We'll hear from Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, who seems determined to fundamentally transform, some might say dismantle, the greatest healthcare system in the world." AOC's expression remained serene, but those who knew her well might have noticed the slight tightening around her eyes. She had expected this opening gambit. Jordan never started small. "Thank you, Chairman Jordan," she replied, her voice clear and measured. "I appreciate the opportunity to discuss how we can ensure that healthcare becomes a human right rather than a privilege reserved for the wealthy." Jordan leaned forward, sensing an opening. "Congresswoman, let's cut through the political rhetoric. Your proposal would eliminate private insurance for over 180 million Americans. How do you justify destroying a system that works for the vast majority of our citizens?" The question came loaded with assumptions, a classic Jordan technique designed to put his target on the defensive from the opening bell. But AOC had been preparing for this moment far longer than Jordan realized. "Chairman Jordan, I appreciate your concern for those 180 million Americans," she began, opening her folder and extracting a single sheet of paper. "But let's talk about the Americans your question doesn't mention. Did you know that 45,000 people die annually in this country simply because they can't afford healthcare? That's more than 120 Americans every single day who lose their lives not to any medical condition, but to poverty." She spoke the statistics with the precision of a surgeon, each number cutting through Jordan's rhetorical flourishes. The room grew quieter, the weight of the numbers settling over the assembled crowd like a heavy blanket. Jordan's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected her to come armed with such stark figures, and certainly not delivered with such calm authority. "Those numbers are disputed, Congresswoman. What's not disputed is that your socialist healthcare scheme would cost taxpayers over $30 trillion. Socialist?" AOC raised an eyebrow, and for the first time, a hint of amusement crept into her voice. "Chairman Jordan, I find it interesting that you use that word. Medicare, which serves our seniors, is overwhelmingly popular. Social Security, which keeps our elderly out of poverty, enjoys bipartisan support. Are you suggesting we should eliminate these programs because they're socialist?" A few scattered chuckles rippled through the gallery. Jordan felt the sting of her rhetorical jujitsu, using his own words against him. His face reddened slightly, the first visible crack in his composed facade. "Don't twist my words, Congresswoman," he snapped, his voice rising. "These are completely different programs. What you're proposing is a government takeover of healthcare that would eliminate choice and create rationing. Choice? AOC leaned back in her chair, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp. Let's talk about choice, Chairman. What choice does a diabetic have when they're rationing insulin because they can't afford their medication? What choice does a family have when they face bankruptcy because their child needs surgery? What choice does a small business owner have when they can't afford to provide insurance to their employees? Each question landed like a precision strike, and Jordan found himself on unfamiliar ground, defending a system whose flaws AOC was methodically exposing. The journalist in the front row was typing furiously, sensing that this exchange was already moving beyond routine political theater. The free market provides choice, Jordan insisted, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Competition drives down costs and improves quality. Government control stifles innovation. AOC nodded thoughtfully, as if genuinely considering his point. That's an interesting theory, Chairman. Tell me, how is that free market working for insulin prices? When the inventors of insulin sold their patent for $1 because they believed it should be available to everyone who needs it, did they envision a free market where people die because they can't afford a medication that costs pennies to produce? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Jordan shifted in his seat, suddenly aware that he was losing control of a hearing he had designed to embarrass his opponent. AOC wasn't playing defense, she was systematically dismantling his arguments while building her own case. You're cherry-picking examples, Jordan said, his voice now noticeably strained. The American healthcare system leads the world in innovation and patient outcomes. Does it? AOC asked quietly, and something in her tone made the entire room lean forward. We spend twice as much per capita on healthcare as any other developed nation, yet we rank poorly in virtually every health outcome measure. We have the highest infant mortality rate among wealthy nations. We have lower life expectancy. We have enough. Jordan's voice exploded through the chamber like a thunderclap. He was on his feet now, his carefully constructed composure finally cracking. You want to turn America into Venezuela. You want to destroy the best healthcare system in the world with your radical leftist agenda. The outburst sent a ripple of shock through the room. Even hardened Washington veterans seemed startled by the sudden shift from policy debate to personal attack. Cameras zoomed in on Jordan's flushed face, capturing the moment when a seasoned politician lost his cool. But AOC remained perfectly still, her hands folded calmly on the table. When she spoke, her voice was softer than before, which somehow made her words carry even more weight. Chairman Jordan, she said, each word measured and deliberate, facts don't care about your feelings. The phrase hit Jordan like a slap. It was his own side's favorite talking point, turned against him with surgical precision. The irony was lost on no one in the room, and several reporters couldn't suppress their grins. Jordan realized, in that moment, that he had walked into something much more dangerous than a routine policy disagreement. AOC wasn't just defending her position, she was systematically dismantling his. And worst of all, she was doing it with a smile. You know what, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez? He said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper as he slowly sat back down. I'm glad you brought up facts. Because I think it's time we had a real conversation about facts. AOC tilted her head slightly, like a chess player who had just seen her opponent make a predictable move. Her fingers drummed once against the manila folder, and for the briefest moment, something that might have been anticipation flickered across her face. I couldn't agree more, Chairman Jordan, she replied, her voice carrying a note of something that sounded almost like gratitude. In fact, I was hoping you would say that. She reached for the folder with deliberate slowness, her movements carrying the weight of ceremony. Because I have some facts here that I think you and the American people will find very interesting indeed. Jordan watched her hands with the growing unease of a man who had just realized he might have walked into a trap of his own making. The manila folder opened with a soft whisper that somehow seemed to echo through the suddenly silent committee chamber. Jordan's eyes fixed on AOC's hands as she extracted what appeared to be a thick stack of documents, each page meticulously organized with colored tabs marking different sections. The methodical way she arranged them suggested this wasn't a spontaneous response, this was preparation that had taken weeks, possibly months. Chairman Jordan, AOC began, her voice carrying the measured tone of a prosecutor presenting evidence. You mentioned facts. Let me share some facts that I believe will illuminate this discussion considerably. She lifted the first document, holding it at an angle where the cameras could catch the official letterhead. This is a transcript of a phone conversation that took place on March 15 of this year. The participants were yourself and Marcus Blackstone, Senior Vice President of Meridian Health Insurance Group. Jordan's face went pale. Meridian was one of the largest insurance conglomerates in the country, and any connection between him and their executives would raise serious questions about conflicts of interest. He started to interrupt, but AOC continued with relentless precision. In this conversation, Mr. Blackstone discusses what he calls strategic legislative positioning regarding healthcare reform bills. Would you like me to read his exact words, or would you prefer to explain to the committee why you were coordinating voting strategies with insurance executives? The room erupted in a low murmur of voices. Journalists were frantically typing, trying to process the implications of what they were hearing. Several Democratic committee members leaned forward with barely concealed excitement, while their Republican colleagues exchanged worried glances. Jordan shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh screech. This is outrageous. These are clearly fabricated documents meant to Chairman Jordan, AOC interrupted smoothly. These documents were obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request filed by the nonprofit watchdog group Citizens for Transparency. Every page has been verified by independent forensic analysts. The phone records corroborating these calls are available through the Federal Communications Commission database. She held up another document, this one bearing the seal of the FCC. Jordan's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He had expected routine political grandstanding, not a meticulously documented case that threatened to unravel his entire political career. Furthermore, AOC continued, her voice gaining momentum, these conversations weren't isolated incidents. Between January and April of this year, you had 17 documented phone calls with various insurance industry executives, totaling over 12 hours of conversation time. The precision of her information was devastating. Jordan realized with growing horror that someone had been tracking his communications with forensic detail. But who? And more importantly, how long had they been watching? This is a witch hunt. Jordan bellowed, but his voice cracked slightly on the last word. These are private conversations taken out of context. This committee doesn't have jurisdiction to actually, Chairman, we do. AOC's response came with the certainty of someone who had thoroughly researched every possible legal challenge. House Ethics Rule 23 specifically addresses member communications with registered lobbyists and industry representatives. Every one of these conversations should have been disclosed under current ethics guidelines. She reached for another document, and Jordan watched with the fascination of a man watching his own execution. But perhaps most interesting is this conversation from April 22, where Mr. Blackstone discusses what he calls investment opportunities for committee members who vote against healthcare reform measures. The word investment hung in the air like a smoking gun. Even the most casual observer understood the implications. Jordan wasn't just coordinating with insurance companies, he was potentially accepting financial inducements to influence his votes. Now wait just a minute. Jordan's voice rose to a near shout. I have never accepted any improper payments or, of course you haven't, AOC agreed with mock sincerity. Because technically, stock options aren't payments. They're investments. Just like the portfolio of pharmaceutical stocks that you acquired just 2 weeks before voting against the prescription drug pricing reform bill. She produced yet another document, this one appearing to be a financial disclosure form. Interesting timing, wouldn't you say? Acquire stocks in companies that would benefit from higher drug prices, then vote to maintain those high prices. Some might call that insider trading, but I suppose you'd call it savvy investing. Jordan felt the room spinning around him. Each revelation was worse than the last, and AOC was delivering them with the relentless efficiency of a demolition expert bringing down a building. His staff members in the gallery were furiously texting, trying to coordinate damage control for a crisis that was expanding by the minute. These are lies, Jordan declared, but his protest sounded desperate even to his own ears. Where did you get these documents? Who gave them to you? AOC paused, and for the first time since she had opened the folder, she smiled. It wasn't a warm smile, it was the expression of a chess player who had just put her opponent in checkmate and was savoring the moment. "That's a very interesting question, Chairman Jordan," she said, setting down the documents and folding her hands. "Because I think you deserve to know exactly how these came to light." The chamber fell silent except for the soft whir of air conditioning and the distant click of camera shutters. Even the reporters had stopped typing, sensing that something momentous was about to happen. "These documents were provided to me by someone who couldn't bear to watch this corruption any longer. Someone who has access to your private communications, your financial records, and your coordination with industry lobbyists. Someone who has been documenting everything for months, waiting for the right moment to expose the truth." Jordan's eyes darted around the room, suddenly suspicious of every face in the gallery. Who among his trusted advisors had been secretly recording his conversations? Who had been tracking his financial transactions? The paranoia that gripped him was visible to everyone watching. "You see, Chairman Jordan," AOC continued, "this person reached out to my office 3 months ago. They said they had information about corruption in the healthcare debate, but they wanted to make sure it was handled responsibly. So we worked together to verify everything, to build an airtight case that couldn't be dismissed or discredited." She gestured toward the gallery, where committee staff members sat watching the proceedings. "The person who gave me these documents is someone you trust completely. Someone who sits in your meetings, handles your correspondence, and has access to your most sensitive communications." Jordan's head snapped toward his staff section, his eyes scanning the faces of people he had worked with for years. His chief of staff, his legislative director, his communications manager, any one of them could be the source of his downfall. The betrayal was like a physical blow, stealing his breath and leaving him gasping. "In fact," AOC said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, "they're in this room right now." The silence stretched like a taut wire about to snap. Jordan's gaze moved frantically from face to face, trying to detect some sign of guilt or deception. But everyone was watching him with expressions of shock and concern, or were they? Was that sympathy in their eyes, or satisfaction? "Who?" he croaked, his voice barely audible. "Who is it?" AOC gathered her documents with the same methodical care she had used to arrange them. "I think that's a conversation you'll need to have with your staff, Chairman Jordan. But I will say this, the person who came forward isn't motivated by politics. They're motivated by conscience. They couldn't stand by and watch while you put corporate profits ahead of people's lives." She looked directly into Jordan's eyes, and he saw something there that chilled him more than any threat, pity. She pitied him. This woman who had just systematically destroyed his reputation was looking at him like a teacher disappointed in a promising student who had chosen the wrong path. The American people deserve to know when their representatives are working for corporate interests instead of public interests, AOC continued. They deserve to know when their votes are being purchased by pharmaceutical companies and insurance conglomerates. They deserve transparency, accountability, and leaders who put their constituents before their portfolios. Jordan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time in his political career, the man known for never backing down from a fight found himself completely speechless. The documents spread across AOC's table told a story that couldn't be spun, couldn't be dismissed, and couldn't be explained away. As he looked around the room at the cameras recording his humiliation, at the journalists already crafting headlines about his downfall, at his own staff members who might be his betrayers, Jordan realized that AOC hadn't just won this particular battle. She had ended the entire confrontation before he even knew it had begun. And somewhere in the gallery, someone who had once been loyal to him was watching his political career crumble, knowing they had struck the match that lit the fire. The weight of silence in the committee chamber had become suffocating. Jordan stood frozen behind the dais, his hands gripping the mahogany surface so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning, and his usual commanding presence had evaporated like morning mist under the harsh glare of television lights. AOC remained seated, her posture relaxed but alert, like a skilled attorney who had just presented her closing argument and was waiting for the jury's verdict. The manila folder before her still contained papers, she hadn't revealed everything yet. That knowledge hung over Jordan like a sword suspended by the thinnest of threads. Chairman Jordan, AOC said finally, breaking the oppressive quiet, I can see that you're struggling to process this information. Perhaps we should take a brief recess so you can consult with your legal counsel? The suggestion was delivered with apparent concern, but everyone in the room understood it for what it really was, a public humiliation disguised as courtesy. Jordan straightened his shoulders, drawing on reserves of political instinct that had carried him through decades of contentious hearings. No recess necessary, Congresswoman, he said, his voice hoarse but defiant. These allegations are serious, but they're also completely fabricated. This is clearly a coordinated attack designed to silence opposition to your radical agenda. It was a desperate gambit, an attempt to reframe the conversation as partisan warfare rather than corruption exposure. But AOC had anticipated this response, and she was ready. Coordinated attack? She repeated thoughtfully. That's an interesting phrase, Chairman. It makes me think of another conversation that might interest the committee. She reached for a different section of her folder, one marked with a bright red tab. This recording is from May 3, just 6 weeks ago. Jordan's eyes fixed on the document with the horrified fascination of a man watching his own funeral preparations. You can't just, these are private conversations. There are legal protections, actually, AOC interrupted gently, there aren't. Not when those conversations involve discussing strategies to suppress congressional investigations. Not when they involve coordination with outside groups to intimidate witnesses. Not when they cross the line from political strategy into obstruction of justice. The phrase obstruction of justice hit the room like a thunderbolt. This was no longer about ethics violations or financial improprieties, this was about criminal behavior. The gravity of the moment settled over everyone present like a heavy blanket, and even the most experienced political observers seemed stunned by the escalation. Jordan's face cycled through several colors before settling on an unhealthy gray. You're talking about privileged communications between a member of Congress and his advisors. There's attorney-client privilege, executive privilege, none of which apply here, AOC said with the certainty of someone who had spent months consulting with constitutional lawyers. Because the communications I'm referring to aren't with your attorneys or your official staff. They're with private citizens who were paid to gather information about committee members, their families, and their personal finances. She lifted the document, and even from across the room, Jordan could see that it was a bank transfer record. $50,000, paid to Heritage Security Consulting. Their specialty, according to their website, is opposition research and reputation management. The euphemism fooled no one. Heritage Security was known throughout Washington as a firm that specialized in digging up dirt on political opponents, using methods that often skirted the edges of legality. The fact that Jordan had hired them suggested a level of desperation and ethical flexibility that shocked even his harshest critics. This is getting ridiculous, Jordan sputtered, but his protest lacked conviction. Opposition research is a normal part of political campaigns, this wasn't during a campaign, Chairman, AOC pointed out. This was 3 months ago, during active committee proceedings. You paid private investigators to dig into the personal lives of sitting members of Congress while those members were participating in official hearings. She paused to let that sink in before delivering the next blow. Including investigations into their children's schools, their spouse's employment, and their mortgage records. Tell me, Chairman Jordan, what legitimate legislative purpose did that serve? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Jordan opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. There was no good answer to that question, and everyone in the room knew it. In the gallery, several of Jordan's own staff members were looking increasingly uncomfortable. One young aide was discreetly gathering his belongings, apparently concluding that his association with Jordan was about to become a serious career liability. Another was typing furiously on her phone, presumably updating her resume in real time. But the most interesting discovery, AOC continued, wasn't what Heritage Security found about us. It was what they found about you. Jordan's blood turned to ice water. He had hired the firm to investigate his opponents, never imagining that they might turn their skills on their own client. But of course they would, information was their business, and damaging information about a sitting committee chairman would be incredibly valuable to the right buyer. It turns out, AOC said, reaching for yet another document, that Heritage Security keeps very detailed records of their work. Not just the reports they deliver to clients, but the methodologies they use, the sources they cultivate, and the evidence they uncover in the process. She held up what appeared to be a comprehensive dossier, thick enough to contain hundreds of pages. When they investigated you as part of their due diligence process, standard practice when taking on new clients, they discovered some fascinating connections. Connections that go far beyond simple campaign contributions or stock purchases. Jordan felt the room beginning to spin. This was impossible. He had been so careful, so methodical in covering his tracks. But apparently not careful enough. Shell companies in the Cayman Islands, AOC continued relentlessly. Real estate investments in properties owned by pharmaceutical executives. A consulting contract with a firm that exists only on paper but somehow pays you $200,000 annually for services that are never specified. Each revelation was like a hammer blow. Jordan's carefully constructed public image was crumbling in real time, broadcast live to millions of viewers who were watching a masterclass in political destruction. "This is all circumstantial," Jordan said weakly. "Financial records can be misinterpreted, which is why I shared all of this information with the appropriate authorities," AOC announced. 3 hours ago, I delivered copies of every document, every recording, and every financial record to the House Ethics Committee, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the Department of Justice." The chamber erupted. Journalists were shouting questions, committee members were demanding recognition, and the gallery was buzzing with excited conversations. But AOC wasn't finished. "In fact," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos with surgical precision, "I have just received word that federal agents are currently executing search warrants at your congressional offices, your district offices, and your personal residence." Jordan's knees buckled slightly. He grabbed the edge of the dais for support, his political instincts finally overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening to him. This wasn't just the end of a hearing, it was the end of his career, his reputation, and possibly his freedom. "The American people deserve better than representatives who sell their votes to the highest bidder," AOC said, standing for the first time since the hearing began. "They deserve leaders who fight for their constituents, not for corporate profits. They deserve transparency, accountability, and justice." She gathered her documents with the same methodical care she had shown throughout the proceedings. "Chairman Jordan, I want to thank you for this opportunity to present the truth to the American people. Sometimes the most important hearings are the ones that expose corruption rather than create legislation." As she spoke, Jordan's phone buzzed with what would be the first of hundreds of calls from reporters, colleagues, and lawyers. His chief of staff was frantically trying to get his attention, holding up her own phone to show him the breaking news alerts that were already flooding social media. "AOC destroys Jordan" was trending on every platform. Cable news channels were interrupting their regular programming for special reports. Political commentators were calling it the most devastating committee hearing in congressional history. But perhaps the most damaging moment came when AOC reached the committee room door and turned back one final time. "Oh, and Chairman Jordan?" she said, her voice carrying easily across the silent chamber. "The staff member who provided these documents asked me to give you a message." Jordan looked up with desperate hope, perhaps thinking that this nightmare might somehow be explained or forgiven. AOC smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Jordan had ever seen. "They said to tell you that some things are more important than loyalty to a person. Things like loyalty to the Constitution, to the American people, and to the truth." With that, she walked out of the hearing room, leaving behind a broken man and a political career in ruins. The cameras captured Jordan's final moment as a powerful committee chairman, standing alone at the dais, surrounded by the wreckage of his own corruption, facing a future that would be decided not by voters, but by prosecutors. In the end, the hearing that was supposed to destroy AOC's healthcare proposals had instead destroyed the man who orchestrated it. And justice, as it sometimes does, had prevailed.